In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, the great clock tower falls silent, and clockmaker Elias Pendleton vanishes, leaving his enigmatic wife Clara in distress. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp mind and unassuming charm, uncovers a web of secrets, a hidden ruby pendant, a cryptic note about the seventh chime, and a sinister stranger with a serpent crest. As a fire threatens to destroy evidence and whispers of Clara's scandalous past surface, Miss Marple sets a trap to unravel the truth. Will she find Elias before the clock's silence becomes permanent, or will Clara's secrets tick away to a deadly end? Chapter 1. The village clock stops. In the serene village of St. Mary Mead, where the rhythm of life seldom faltered, the morning of October 12th brought an unsettling pause. The great clock in the village square, a towering sentinel of oak and brass crafted by Mr. Elias Pendleton, ceased its faithful ticking at precisely 11:07. Its silence hung over the cobblestone square like a fog, prompting murmurs of unease among the villagers. For decades, Elias's clock had marked their days with unerring precision, its chimes a comforting constant. Now, its stillness felt like a breach in the natural order. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her modest cottage by the window, observed the gathering crowd from behind her lace curtains. Her nimble fingers paused over her knitting, a delicate shawl of pale blue wool, as she noted the villagers' furrowed brows and hushed speculations. Mrs. Bantry, bustling past with her market basket, called out to the butcher that it was positively unnatural for Elias's clock to fail. Mr. Hayworth, the postmaster, muttered something about ill omens. Miss Marple, whose keen understanding of human nature rivaled her skill with needles, found the event intriguing. Elias Pendleton was not a man to let his work lapse. At 2:30, a tentative knock sounded at Miss Marple's door. She opened it to find Mrs. Clara Pendleton, Elias's wife of 3 years, standing on the threshold. Clara, a woman of striking beauty with porcelain skin and dark, expressive eyes, seemed diminished by anxiety. Her hands twisted the edge of her shawl, and her voice, though soft, carried a tremor. "Miss Marple, I hope I'm not intruding," she began, accepting the offer of a chair by the hearth. "It's Elias. He didn't come home last night." Miss Marple poured tea from a bone china pot, her movements deliberate, her eyes gently probing. "That is unlike Mr. Pendleton," she remarked, offering a scone. "He is so devoted to his craft. Was he working late, perhaps?" Clara nodded, her fingers tightening around the teacup. "He's been preoccupied with a special commission, a clock for a gentleman in London. He's spent nights at the shop, but he always returns by dawn. This time," her voice faltered, and she glanced at the window, as if expecting Elias to appear. Miss Marple noted the faint shadows under Clara's eyes, the nervous dart of her glance. There was more here, she sensed, than a husband's late hours. "Tell me, my dear," Miss Marple said, her tone as soothing as the crackle of the fire. "Did anything unusual happen recently? A visitor, perhaps, or a letter that troubled him?" Clara hesitated, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. "No, nothing," she said at last, too quickly. "He was just busy." But her eyes, meeting Miss Marple's for a fleeting moment, betrayed a flicker of fear. Miss Marple did not press. She had learned long ago that secrets, like seeds, surfaced in their own time. After Clara's departure, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her mind turning over the encounter. Clara, though charming, was an enigma in St. Mary Mead. She had arrived as Elias's bride, her past a closed book. The villagers, fond of gossip, speculated about her origins. Some said she was a governess, others a widow, but no one knew for certain. Elias, a reserved man in his 50s, had married her with quiet pride, and their life seemed harmonious. Yet now, with the clock stopped and Elias missing, Miss Marple wondered if Clara's past had cast a shadow over their present. That evening at the vicarage, Miss Marple joined the weekly tea, where the clock's failure dominated conversation. Mrs. Price, the baker's wife and an indefatigable gossip, leaned forward, her voice low with intrigue. "I saw Clara arguing with a man by the clock tower last week," she confided. "A stranger, sharp-looking, in a city suit. Not from here, that's certain." The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, frowned at the gossip, but Miss Marple tucked the detail away, her expression as placid as ever. As she walked home under the autumn stars, the silent clock looming in the square, Miss Marple's thoughts aligned like the gears of Elias's creations. A stopped clock, a missing husband, a stranger's visit, and Clara's guarded demeanour. These were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and sharp intellect, was determined to fit them together. Chapter 2. The Clockmaker's Shop. The morning following Clara Pendleton's visit, a fine mist draped St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of its thatched roofs and cobblestone paths. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the damp, donned her sturdy tweed coat and set out for Elias Pendleton's clock shop. Her steps were measured, her umbrella a practical shield, but her mind buzzed with purpose. The stopped village clock and Elias's absence were no mere coincidences. They were threads in a tapestry of mystery, and Miss Marple, with her knack for unravelling human motives, intended to trace them. The clock shop stood at the edge of the village square, its sign, E. Pendleton Clockmaker, swaying gently in the breeze. The windows, usually aglow with the warm light of Elias's work lamp, were dark, and the door, when Miss Marple tested it, creaked open with unsettling ease. She stepped inside, her senses sharpened by the stillness. The air carried the faint scent of polished wood and oil, and the room was a symphony of silent mechanisms, clocks of every size, from delicate mantelpieces to towering grandfathers, stood frozen, their pendulums idle. Miss Marple's eyes, accustomed to spotting the smallest irregularities, scanned the space with care. The shop was tidy, as befitted Elias's meticulous nature, but a single drawer in the workbench gaped open, its contents slightly askew. Miss Marple approached, her gloved fingers brushing the edge of the oak surface. Inside the drawer lay a scattering of tools, a ledger of repair notes, and tucked beneath a cloth, a slip of paper. She lifted it carefully, her lips pursing as she read the words scrawled in Elias's precise hand. "The seventh chime holds the truth." The phrase was cryptic, yet it stirred a memory of Elias's pride in the village clock, which chimed 7 times at dawn and dusk. Miss Marple folded the note and slipped it into her handbag, her mind already turning over its possible meanings. Her gaze shifted to a grandfather clock in the corner, its mahogany case gleaming under a shaft of light from the window. Unlike the others, it bore a faint scratch along its base, as if it had been dragged across the floor. Miss Marple knelt, her knees protesting slightly, and examined the mark. It was fresh, the wood's grain disturbed, suggesting recent movement. She tested the clock's weight with a gentle push. It was heavy but not immovable. A suspicion formed, but she filed it away, knowing better than to leap to conclusions without further evidence. As she rose, her eye caught a small object on the workbench, a handkerchief, delicately embroidered with the initials CL. Miss Marple paused, her thoughts flickering to Clara. The initials were curious. Clara's maiden name was a mystery to the village, and Elias, when asked, had deflected with a smile. The handkerchief's presence in the shop, so far from Clara's usual domain, struck Miss Marple as significant. Had Clara been here recently, or had Elias kept it as a keepsake? She left it undisturbed, noting its fine linen and the faint scent of lavender clinging to it. Constable Reed arrived shortly after, his boots heavy on the shop's floorboards. A young man with a square jaw and a penchant for procedure, He greeted Miss Marple with polite deference, but little imagination. "I've searched the place, Miss Marple," he said, adjusting his cap. "No sign of Mr. Pendleton, nor any struggle. Likely he's off on some errand and forgot to tell his wife." His tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple detected a trace of unease in his eyes. Elias's disappearance, coupled with the stopped clock, was beyond the constable's usual fare of lost sheep or petty thefts. "Did you examine the clocks themselves, Constable?" Miss Marple asked, her voice mild but pointed. Mr. Pendleton was particular about his work. A fault in one might tell us something. Reed hesitated, then admitted he had not. With his permission, Miss Marple lingered as he made another cursory sweep. She tapped the grandfather clock gently, listening for irregularities, but its mechanism seemed intact. The scratch, however, nagged at her. She resolved to return later, perhaps with less official company, to explore further. That afternoon, Miss Marple attended the weekly sewing circle at Mrs. Clement's vicarage, where the village's women gathered to stitch and gossip. The talk, predictably, centered on Elias's absence and the silent clock. Mrs. Price, her needle flashing through a quilt, leaned forward with a conspiratorial air. "I saw Clara with that stranger again, near the post office, 2 days before Elias vanished," she declared. "He was a city type. Sharp suit, polished shoes, and a look about him like he owned the place. They were arguing, mark my words, though I couldn't hear what about." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her expression one of polite interest. "A stranger, you say? Did he give a name? Or perhaps you noticed anything distinctive?" she asked, her tone as casual as if discussing the weather. Mrs. Price, eager to impress, described the man's dark overcoat and a silver pin on his lapel, shaped like a coiled serpent. "Not the sort we see in St. Mary Mead," she added, her voice dropping to a dramatic whisper. "And Clara looked proper shaken after he left." The other women murmured, their imaginations alight, but Miss Marple merely nodded, storing the detail alongside the handkerchief and the note. After the circle, Miss Marple stopped by the post office to speak with Mr. Hayworth, a wiry man with a memory for every letter that passed through his hands. "Oh, aye, Miss Marple," he said, polishing his spectacles. "Mr. Pendleton's been getting letters from London these past months. One came just last week, with a fancy crest. Looked like a snake, it did. I thought it odd, him being so private." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind connecting the serpent crest to Mrs. Price's description. A pattern was emerging, though its shape remained elusive. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting neglected as she pondered. The stranger's presence, the serpent crest, and Clara's unease suggested a connection to her past, one Elias might have been drawn into. The note about the 7th chime hinted at a secret hidden in plain sight, perhaps within the village clock itself. Miss Marple knew Elias as a man of principle, devoted to Clara despite their age difference. Had he uncovered something that put him at risk, or was he protecting his wife from a threat she dared not name? The next morning, Miss Marple returned to the clock shop, this time alone. The village was quiet, the mist having lifted to reveal a pale sun. She slipped inside, her movements careful, and approached the grandfather clock. With a small effort, she shifted it aside, revealing a faint outline in the floorboards, a trapdoor cleverly concealed. Her heart quickened, but she did not open it. The risk of discovery was too great without assistance. Instead, she noted its position and replaced the clock, ensuring no trace of her investigation remained. As she left the shop, she encountered Clara, who was hurrying across the square, her face pale. "Miss Marple!" Clara exclaimed, her voice catching. "Have you found anything? I'm at my wit's end." Her eyes, wide with worry, searched Miss Marple's face, but there was something else, a guardedness that belied her distress. "Not yet, my dear. Miss Marple replied, her tone soothing. "But I'm certain Elias is safe. Perhaps you could tell me more about this special commission he was working on. It might help us understand his whereabouts." Clara's lips tightened, and she shook her head. "It was just a clock, nothing more. For a client in London. Elias didn't say much about it." Her words were clipped, and she excused herself quickly, claiming a headache. Miss Marple watched her retreat, noting the nervous glance Clara cast toward the shop. That evening, a sudden commotion disrupted the village's calm. Smoke billowed from the clock shop, and cries of "Fire!" echoed through the square. Miss Marple, alerted by her neighbour, hurried to the scene, where villagers were already forming a bucket brigade. The flames were confined to a corner of the shop, where several smaller clocks were reduced to charred husks. The grandfather clock, however, stood untouched, its polished surface gleaming defiantly in the firelight. Constable Reed, directing the effort, declared the fire an accident, likely caused by an overturned lamp. Miss Marple, however, was unconvinced. The precision of the blaze, sparing the grandfather clock, suggested intent. She recalled the trapdoor and wondered if the fire was meant to destroy evidence or to warn someone. As the crowd dispersed, she lingered, her eyes on the shop's darkened windows. The handkerchief, she realised, was no longer on the workbench. Had Clara retrieved it, or had someone else? Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat with a cup of tea, her mind sifting through the day's discoveries. The note, the scratch, the trapdoor, the serpent crest, and now the fire formed a constellation of clues, each pointing to a deeper truth. Clara's reticence and the stranger's presence suggested a past that refused to stay buried. Elias, Miss Marple suspected, was either a victim or a guardian of that past. The seventh chime, she resolved, would be her next focus, a clue that might unlock the secret of the clockmaker's wife. As the village clock remained silent, its hands frozen at 11:07, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the rhythms of human nature. In St. Mary Mead, as in life, secrets were like clocks. They ticked quietly until their mechanisms could no longer be contained. With a final sip of tea, she set her cup down, her resolve as steady as the needles in her knitting basket. The truth, she knew, was only a matter of time. Chapter 3. The Stranger's Shadow. The dawn broke over St. Mary Mead, with a chill that lingered in the air, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a modest spread of toast and marmalade, turned her thoughts to the events of the previous day. The fire at Elias Pendleton's clock shop, the cryptic note about the seventh chime, and the mysterious trapdoor beneath the grandfather clock had sharpened her curiosity. Clara Pendleton's guarded demeanour and the whispers of a stranger with a serpent crest pin suggested a tangle of secrets, and Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human nature, was determined to unravel it. After breakfast, she donned her hat and coat, her appearance as unassuming as ever, and set out for the village post office. Mr. Hayworth, the postmaster, had mentioned a letter with a serpent crest, and Miss Marple hoped to glean more about its sender. The post office, a small building fragrant with ink and paper, was quiet save for the rustle of Mr. Hayworth sorting the morning's mail. He greeted her with a nod, his spectacles glinting as he peered over them. "Good morning, Mr. Hayworth," Miss Marple said, her voice warm but precise. "I was wondering if you might recall any further details about those letters Mr. Pendleton received from London. The ones with the serpent crest, I believe you said." Mr. Hayworth paused, his fingers hovering over a stack of envelopes. "Well, now, Miss Marple, you've a memory like a steel trap," he said, a touch of admiration in his tone. "There was one letter, arrived last Tuesday, addressed to Elias in a fine hand. The crest was clear as day, a snake coiled round a staff. I thought it peculiar, as Elias never spoke of city folk. The return address was a solicitor's office in London, Grayson and Sons, if I recall. Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained serene. Grayson and Sons, you say? That's most helpful, Mr. Hayworth. And no other letters of note? None that stood out, he replied, scratching his chin, though Elias did seem distracted when he collected that one, kept it in his pocket, didn't even open it here, which wasn't like him. Thanking him, Miss Marple stepped back into the crisp morning, her mind alight with possibilities. A solicitor's letter suggested legal matters, perhaps a will, a debt, or something more sinister. The serpent crest, linked to both the letter and the stranger Mrs. Price had seen, hinted at a connection that reached beyond St. Mary Mead. She resolved to write to Grayson and Sons, but first she needed to revisit the clock shop. The shop, now tinged with the acrid scent of smoke, was cordoned off by Constable Reed's orders, though the damage was confined to a corner. Miss Marple, with a polite word to the young officer guarding the door, gained entry under the pretense of retrieving a shawl she claimed to have left behind. Inside, the air was heavy, and the charred remains of several clocks lay in a heap. The grandfather clock, however, stood unscathed, its presence almost defiant. Miss Marple approached it, her eyes tracing the scratch on its base and the outline of the trapdoor beneath. She knelt, her movements careful, and examined the floorboards. The trapdoor was cleverly fitted, its edges nearly invisible unless one knew to look. She did not attempt to open it, aware that such an action required discretion and perhaps assistance. Instead, she turned her attention to the workbench, where the handkerchief with CL had been. As she suspected, it was gone, its absence confirming her suspicion that someone, Clara perhaps, or another, had visited the shop after the fire. As she straightened, a glint caught her eye. Tucked behind a stack of clock weights was a small photograph, its edges worn but intact. Miss Marple lifted it carefully, her breath catching as she studied it. The image showed a younger Clara, her face radiant, standing arm in arm with a man whose features were obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. The background suggested a city park, with blurred figures and a fountain. On the back, in faded ink, was written, London, 1922. Miss Marple slipped the photograph into her handbag, her mind racing. Clara had claimed no ties to London, yet this image suggested otherwise. Who was the man, and why had the photograph been hidden? Returning to her cottage, Miss Marple prepared a pot of tea and sat by the window, the photograph before her. The date, 1922, placed Clara in London before her marriage to Elias, who had brought her to St. Mary Mead in 1922. The initials CL on the handkerchief suggested a maiden name, but Clara's reticence about her past raised questions. Was the man in the photograph the stranger Mrs. Price described, or someone else from Clara's former life? Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the serpent crest, a symbol that seemed to bind these fragments together. That afternoon, she penned a letter to Grayson and Sons, posing as a concerned acquaintance of Elias Pendleton, inquiring about his recent correspondence. She worded it with care, knowing solicitors guarded their clients' secrets closely. As she sealed the envelope, a knock at the door announced Clara's arrival. The young woman's face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, though she carried herself with a fragile composure. "Miss Marple, I couldn't stay away," Clara said, accepting a chair. "I'm so worried about Elias. Have you learned anything?" Her hands twisted in her lap, and Miss Marple noted the absence of the lavender-scented handkerchief. "I'm making inquiries, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle. "But perhaps you could help me. This photograph, was it a family member, perhaps, from your time in London?" She produced the image, watching Clara's reaction closely. Clara's eyes widened and her hand flew to her mouth. "Where did you find this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. It's an old cousin, long gone. I didn't know Elias kept it." Her words were hurried, and she avoided Miss Marple's gaze, focusing instead on the teacup she clutched. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of kindly concern. "It's natural to keep mementos," she said, though her mind noted Clara's evasiveness. "And this cousin, did he ever visit St. Mary Mead?" "No, never," Clara said quickly, rising. "I must go, Miss Marple. Thank you for your kindness." She departed with undue haste, leaving Miss Marple to ponder the lie. Clara's reaction confirmed the photograph's significance, but her refusal to name the man suggested fear or guilt. That evening, Miss Marple attended a village meeting at the church hall, where the stopped clock and Elias's absence were the talk of St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Bantry, ever dramatic, suggested foul play, while Mr. Clement, the vicar, called for calm. Miss Marple listened, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, as villagers speculated about Elias's whereabouts. A new detail emerged from Miss Hartnell, a spinster with a sharp tongue. She had seen Clara leaving the village by the early train to London a month prior, returning the same day looking positively ill. "London, you say?" Miss Marple asked, her tone mild. "Did she mention her purpose?" "Not a word," Miss Hartnell replied, her eyes gleaming with suspicion. But she was clutching a parcel, wrapped tight, like it was something precious. As the meeting dispersed, Miss Marple walked home under a sky heavy with stars, her thoughts weaving a pattern: the photograph, the serpent crest, Clara's London trip, and the stranger's argument pointed to a past that Clara wished to conceal. The fire, she suspected, was no accident but a deliberate act to destroy evidence, or to frighten someone into silence. The trapdoor in the shop, linked to the note about the seventh chime, might hold the key, but she needed more before acting. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting untouched. She recalled a similar case in her youth, when a young woman's past had returned to haunt her, leading to deception and tragedy. Clara, she sensed, was caught in a similar web, and Elias's disappearance was its consequence. The serpent crest, she mused, might belong to a family, a society, or even a criminal enterprise. Tomorrow she would visit the clock tower, where the seventh chime might reveal its truth. For now, she sipped her tea, her mind as sharp as the needles in her basket, ready to pierce the shadow cast by the stranger. Chapter 4. The Seventh Chime. The mist had cleared from St. Mary Mead by the following morning, replaced by a crisp sunlight that glinted off the silent village clock. Miss Jane Marple, fortified by a simple breakfast of tea and toast, sat at her writing desk, her thoughts fixed on the cryptic note from Elias Pendleton's shop. The seventh chime holds the truth. The phrase, coupled with the trapdoor beneath the grandfather clock and the photograph of a younger Clara with an unidentified man, suggested a secret embedded in the village's very heart. Miss Marple, whose unassuming demeanour belied a mind as precise as any clockmaker's, resolved to investigate the village clock tower itself. With a basket of knitting as her pretext, she approached the vicarage, where Mr. Clement, the vicar, was pruning his roses. His kindly face broke into a smile as he greeted her. "Miss Marple, what brings you out so early? Not more trouble with that clock, I hope." "Not trouble, Mr. Clement, but curiosity," she replied, her tone light. "I wondered if I might have a look at the clock tower. It's such a fine piece of Mr. Pendleton's work, and with it stopped, I thought perhaps a closer inspection might offer some insight." Mr. Clement, ever obliging, agreed at once. He fetched the heavy iron key from the vicarage and led her across the square to the clock tower, a sturdy structure of weathered stone that loomed over St. Mary Mead. Its face, frozen at 11:07, seemed to gaze down with a silent reproach. Inside, the air was cool and musty, filled with the faint creak of gears long stilled. The mechanism, a marvel of Elias's craftsmanship, dominated the space, its brass cogs and pendulums gleaming faintly in the dim light filtering through a narrow window. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp despite her years, scanned the tower's interior. She noted the ladder leading to the clock's workings and the stone floor, worn smooth by decades of maintenance. As Mr. Clement explained the clock's history, how Elias had restored it single-handedly 10 years prior, Miss Marple's attention fixed on the base of the mechanism. The note's mention of the 7th chime suggested a specific moment or component, and she intended to find it. "Mr. Clement, might we set the clock to chime, just once?" she asked, her voice carrying the innocent curiosity of an elderly spinster. "I've always admired its tone, and it might help us understand why it stopped." The vicar, though puzzled, complied, adjusting the mechanism to strike the hour. As the clock reached the 7th chime, a deep, resonant note echoed through the tower, followed by a faint, hollow sound, as if the stone itself had answered. Miss Marple's heart quickened. She knelt by the base, her fingers tracing the stones until she found one slightly misaligned, its edges betraying a subtle seam. With Mr. Clement's help, she pressed it, and a small panel slid open, revealing a concealed compartment. Inside lay a wooden box, no larger than a cigar case, its surface engraved with a serpent crest identical to that described by Mr. Hayworth. Miss Marple lifted it carefully, her gloved hands steady. Within the box was a ruby pendant, its facets catching the light like a drop of blood, and a folded letter addressed to CL in Elias's meticulous script. She slipped both into her basket, promising Mr. Clement to inform Constable Reed of the find, though she intended to examine the contents first. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, the letter and pendant before her. The letter, written in Elias's hand, read, "My dearest CL, this is yours by right, a debt repaid. I have kept my promise to shield you, though it cost me dearly. Let no one take it from you." The words were cryptic, yet poignant, suggesting Elias's devotion to Clara and a burden he had borne in secret. The ruby pendant, exquisitely crafted, was no mere trinket. Its value was evident, but its significance lay in its connection to Clara's past. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the village gossip. Mrs. Price had spoken of Clara's argument with the stranger, and Miss Hartnell had noted her secretive trip to London, clutching a parcel. The photograph from the shop, showing Clara with a man in 1922, hinted at a life before St. Mary Mead, one Clara was reluctant to discuss. The serpent crest, appearing on both the letter and the stranger's pin, suggested a link to a specific individual or family, perhaps one with influence or menace. Determined to learn more, Miss Marple visited the village library, a modest room overseen by Miss Weatherby, a retired schoolteacher with a penchant for local history. "Miss Weatherby," Miss Marple began, her tone conversational, "I've come across a curious crest, a serpent coiled round a staff. Does it ring any bells, perhaps from a family in London?" Miss Weatherby's eyes lit up at the challenge. She rummaged through a stack of genealogical records, her fingers nimble despite her age. "A serpent and staff, you say? That sounds like the Hargreaves family, an old London line. They were wealthy, owned a shipping firm, but there was talk of scandal some years back. Something about a son who fell into debt and disgrace. The crest was theirs, though, unmistakable." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind racing. The Hargreaves name was a clue, tying the serpent crest to Clara's past. Had the stranger been a Hargreaves, or someone connected to them? The ruby pendant, she suspected, was no stolen bauble, but a family heirloom, perhaps tied to the scandal Miss Weatherby mentioned. Elias's letter suggested he had protected Clara's claim to it, but at what cost? That afternoon, Miss Marple called on Clara at the Pendleton cottage, a neat house with ivy-clad walls. Clara, pale and drawn, received her with a forced smile. "Any news of Elias?" she asked, her voice brittle as she poured tea. "Not yet, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her eyes gentle but observant. "But I found something curious in the clock tower, a pendant, and a letter addressed to CL. Might they mean something to you?" Clara's cup rattled against its saucer, and her eyes darted to Miss Marple's face. "A pendant? I don't know anything about it," she stammered. "Elias never mentioned such a thing." Her denial was swift, but her hands trembled, betraying her agitation. Miss Marple pressed gently, her tone as soothing as a lullaby. "It's a beautiful piece, a ruby, perhaps a family keepsake. The letter spoke of a promise kept, a debt repaid." Clara's composure faltered, and she rose, pacing to the window. "It's nothing, Miss Marple. Just some old trinket, I'm sure. Please, don't trouble yourself." Her voice was strained, and she changed the subject, asking about the village's efforts to repair the clock. Miss Marple, sensing the wall of secrecy, did not push further but noted Clara's fear, as palpable as the chill in the room. As she left the cottage, Miss Marple's thoughts aligned like the gears of Elias's clocks. The ruby pendant, the serpent crest, and the letter pointed to a past Clara wished to conceal, one Elias had shielded her from. The stranger, possibly a Hargreaves, might be a creditor, a blackmailer, or worse. The fire in the shop, sparing the grandfather clock, suggested someone knew of the trapdoor and its secrets, or sought to destroy them. The seventh chime had revealed a piece of the puzzle, but the full picture remained elusive. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the pendant and letter locked safely in her writing desk. She recalled a case from her youth, when a young woman's hidden past had led to blackmail and betrayal. Clara, she suspected, was caught in a similar snare, and Elias's disappearance was its consequence. The Hargreaves connection, the ruby's significance, and the stranger's motives were threads she must follow. Tomorrow, she would await a reply from Grayson and Sons, the London solicitors, hoping their response would shed light on the shadow cast over St. Mary Mead. As the village settled into silence, the clock tower stood mute, its hands frozen. Miss Marple, her knitting idle in her lap, felt the weight of the mystery. Like a clock's mechanism, each clue was a cog, turning toward the truth. She closed her eyes, her mind as sharp as ever, ready to hear the next chime of revelation. Chapter 5. The Solicitor's Visit. The morning sun cast a pale glow over St. Mary Mead, its light filtering through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage. She sat at her writing desk, her fingers poised over a half-finished letter, her thoughts tethered to the ruby pendant and Elias Pendleton's cryptic note, both now safely locked in a drawer. The serpent crest, linking the stranger, the letter in the clock tower, and the London solicitors Grayson and Sons had deepened the mystery. Clara Pendleton's evasiveness about the photograph and the pendant suggested a past she was desperate to conceal, and Miss Marple, with her quiet acumen, was determined to uncover it. Her letter to Grayson and Sons, sent the previous day under the guise of a concerned acquaintance, had been carefully worded to elicit information without arousing suspicion. As she sipped her morning tea, a knock at the door announced the arrival of the post. Among the usual circulars was a reply from London, its envelope bearing the serpent crest Mr. Hayworth had described. Miss Marple opened it with care, her eyes scanning the precise script of Mr. Alistair Grayson, senior partner of the firm. The letter was courteously formal, expressing regret at Elias Pendleton's absence, and confirming that he had consulted Grayson and Sons regarding a trust fund established for his wife, Clara Langley. The name struck Miss Marple like a chime. Langley, matching the initials CL on the handkerchief and the letter in the clock tower. Mr. Grayson hinted that the fund was tied to a delicate matter involving a prominent London family, but professional discretion prevented further details. He offered to visit St. Mary Mead, to discuss the matter in person, should it aid in locating Elias. Miss Marple, sensing an opportunity, penned a swift reply, inviting him to call the following day. As she sealed the envelope, her thoughts turned to Clara's reaction to the pendant. The young woman's fear had been palpable, her denial too quick to be truthful. The trust fund, Miss Marple mused, might be the key to Clara's past, and Elias's disappearance could be its consequence. The serpent crest, linked to the Hargreaves family, according to Miss Weatherby, suggested a connection that reached beyond the village's quiet borders. The next morning, Mr. Alistair Grayson arrived by the early train, a wiry man in his 50s, with sharp grey eyes and a manner both polished and guarded. Miss Marple received him in her parlour, offering tea and a plate of homemade biscuits. His suit, impeccably tailored, bore a silver pin with the serpent crest, confirming his connection to the clues she had gathered. After pleasantries, she steered the conversation to Elias. "Mr. Grayson, your letter mentioned a trust fund for Mrs. Pendleton," Miss Marple said, her tone mild but probing. "Might you share anything that could help us find her husband? The village is quite concerned." Grayson's fingers tightened briefly on his teacup, a flicker of caution crossing his face. "Mr. Pendleton was a client of some years," he replied. "He established a trust for his wife, Clara Langley, to secure her future. The funds came from a settlement, the details of which are confidential. I can say it involved a family of means, the Hargreaves, who wished to resolve a past indiscretion." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her expression one of polite interest. "An indiscretion, you say? How unfortunate. Was Mrs. Pendleton aware of this arrangement?" Grayson hesitated, choosing his words with care. "She was informed, though I believe Mr. Pendleton handled the particulars. He was most protective of her. The trust was meant to provide for her, should anything happen to him." The implication hung in the air, and Miss Marple noted Grayson's reticence. The Hargreaves name, tied to both the serpent crest and Clara's past, suggested a scandal that had followed her to St. Mary Mead. She thanked Grayson, who promised to notify her of any developments, and watched him depart for the train, his sharp eyes scanning the village square as if expecting to see Elias himself. That afternoon, Miss Marple called on Clara at the Pendleton cottage, hoping to coax more from her. Clara, dressed in a simple grey frock, seemed more composed, though her eyes betrayed exhaustion. "Miss Marple, have you heard from Elias?" she asked, her voice tinged with hope. "Not yet, my dear," Miss Marple replied, settling into a chair. "But I spoke with Mr. Grayson, the solicitor. He mentioned a trust fund in your name, Clara Langley. It seems Elias took great care to secure your future." Clara's face paled and her hands clenched in her lap. "Langley? I don't know what you mean," she stammered. "Elias never spoke of such a thing." Her denial was unconvincing, and Miss Marple pressed gently, her voice as soothing as a summer breeze. "It must be difficult keeping such matters private," she said. "But the pendant I found and the letter addressed to C.L., they suggest a connection to your life before St. Mary Mead. Perhaps a family matter or someone from your past." Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she rose, pacing to the window. "You don't understand, Miss Marple," she said, her voice breaking. "I was a governess in London, working for the Hargreaves family. They accused me of stealing a jewel, the ruby pendant. It wasn't true, but they dismissed me, and I fled to avoid disgrace. Elias found me, married me, and promised to protect me. But now," she trailed off, her gaze fixed on the silent clock tower. Miss Marple's heart softened, though her mind remained sharp. "And the stranger Mrs. Price saw you with, was he from that time?" Clara nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Victor Hargreaves, the family's son. He found me a month ago, demanding the pendant. He said it was his by right, that I'd stolen it. I told him I didn't have it, but he wouldn't believe me. Elias, Elias said he'd handle it. Her words dissolved into a sob, and Miss Marple offered a handkerchief, her mind racing. Victor Hargreaves, with his serpent crest pin, was the stranger, and his pursuit of the pendant explained Clara's fear. Elias's letter and the trust fund suggested he had taken steps to shield her, perhaps by hiding the pendant in the clock tower. The fire in the shop, Miss Marple suspected, was Victor's attempt to destroy evidence or intimidate Clara. But where was Elias, and why had he vanished? As she left the cottage, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the trapdoor in the shop. The grandfather clock, spared by the fire, might hold further clues, but she needed to proceed cautiously. Victor Hargreaves was a threat, and his presence in St. Mary Mead suggested he was not acting alone. The trust fund, tied to the Hargreaves family, hinted at a deeper motive, perhaps a scandal they wished to bury, or a debt they sought to reclaim. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the ruby pendant glinting in the lamplight. She recalled a case from her nephew's time as a detective, where a family's greed had led to blackmail and ruin. Clara, she sensed, was a pawn in a larger game, and Elias's disappearance was its price. The seventh chime had revealed the pendant, but the truth of Victor's intentions and Elias's fate remained shrouded. Tomorrow, she would revisit the shop, hoping the trapdoor would yield more answers. For now, she locked the pendant away, her mind as steady as the ticking of a clock, poised to uncover the next piece of the puzzle. Chapter 6. The Trap. The soft glow of dawn bathed St. Mary Mead in a gentle light, but a restless energy stirred within Miss Jane Marple as she prepared for the day. The revelations from Clara Pendleton, coupled with Mr. Grayson's disclosure about the trust fund and the Hargreaves family, had tightened the threads of the mystery. The ruby pendant, hidden in the clock tower, and the serpent crest linking Victor Hargreaves to Clara's past, suggested a web of deceit and danger. Elias Pendleton's disappearance, Miss Marple suspected, was no mere accident, but a deliberate act tied to his efforts to shield his wife. With her characteristic blend of intuition and precision, she resolved to draw out the truth by setting a trap for the elusive Victor Hargreaves. Over breakfast, Miss Marple devised a plan as carefully as she might a knitting pattern. Victor's pursuit of the ruby pendant indicated he believed Clara possessed it, and his presence in St. Mary Mead suggested he was close to acting. If Clara could be persuaded to lure him to a meeting, under the pretense of returning the pendant, Miss Marple might observe his intentions and perhaps uncover Elias's fate. The clock tower, central to the mystery, would be the ideal setting, its isolation offering both opportunity and risk. She called on Clara at the Pendleton cottage, finding the young woman in a state of fragile resolve. Clara's eyes, red from sleepless nights, met Miss Marple's with a mixture of hope and dread. "Miss Marple, have you found anything new?" she asked, her voice low as she gestured to a chair by the hearth. "I believe we're close to answers, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her tone as soothing as ever. "But we need your help. The pendant you spoke of, it's clear Victor Hargreaves wants it badly. If you were to arrange a meeting with him, say at the clock tower, and offer to return it, we might learn his true purpose. Constable Reed and I would ensure your safety." Clara's hands trembled, and she shook her head. "Victor's dangerous, Miss Marple. He's not the boy I knew in London. He threatened to ruin me, to tell the village I'm a thief. I can't face him." Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes kind but firm. "I understand your fear, Clara, but Elias may be in peril because of this man. If we act together, we can protect you both. Will you trust me?" After a long pause, Clara nodded, her shoulders sagging. "I'll do it. For Elias." She agreed to send a message to Victor through the post office, where he had last been seen inquiring about Elias. The note, drafted with Miss Marple's guidance, was simple. "I have the pendant. Meet me at the clock tower at midnight. Come alone. Miss Marple then visited Constable Reed, who, though sceptical of her plan, agreed to hide near the tower with a deputy. "I don't like using Mrs. Pendleton as bait, Miss Marple," he said, his brow furrowed. "But if you're sure this Hargreaves is behind it, I'll be there." As midnight approached, the village lay quiet, the silent clock tower casting a long shadow across the square. Miss Marple, wrapped in a dark shawl, positioned herself behind a yew tree near the tower, her view unobstructed. Constable Reed and his deputy crouched in the shadows of the churchyard, their presence concealed by the night. Clara arrived, clutching a small box, empty, but meant to convince Victor she held the pendant. Her face was pale, but she stood resolute at the tower's base. At the stroke of midnight, a figure emerged from the darkness, a man in a sharp overcoat, his silver serpent pin glinting under the moonlight. Victor Hargreaves's face was lean and predatory, his eyes scanning the square before fixing on Clara. "You've kept me waiting, Clara," he said, his voice smooth but edged with menace. "The pendant. Hand it over, and I'll leave you in peace." Clara's voice wavered but held firm. "I want your word, Victor. No more threats, no more lies about my past." Victor's lips curled into a cold smile. "Your past is a lie, Clara Langley. A governess who stole from my family. The pendant's mine by right. Give it to me, or I'll make sure St. Mary Mead knows what you are." Before Clara could respond, a rustle came from the tower's entrance. To Miss Marple's astonishment, Elias Pendleton stepped into the moonlight, his clothes dishevelled, his face gaunt but determined. "Enough, Hargreaves," he said, his voice steady despite his haggard appearance. "The pendant belongs to Clara, a gift from her mother. You've no claim to it." Clara gasped, rushing to Elias's side. "Elias! You're alive!" Her relief was palpable, but Victor's expression darkened, his hand twitching toward his pocket. Miss Marple, watching from her vantage point, signalled to Constable Reed, who emerged with his deputy, lanterns raised. "That's enough, Mr. Hargreaves," Reed called, his tone authoritative. "Step away from Mrs. Pendleton." Victor's eyes darted between Elias and the constable, his composure cracking. "You don't understand," he spat. "That pendant was my family's promise to cover my debts. Clara's a thief, and he's been hiding her lies." Elias stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "I hid in the tower to protect Clara. I knew you'd come for the pendant, Victor. I've watched you skulk about, setting that fire to scare us. But it's over." He turned to Clara, his eyes softening. "The pendant was your mother's, Clara, left to you in her will. I kept it safe, as I promised." Victor lunged, his hand reaching for the box in Clara's grasp. But Reed was quicker, seizing his arm. The deputy secured Victor's wrists, and Miss Marple stepped forward, her presence quiet but commanding. "Mr. Hargreaves," she said, her voice clear in the night air, "your pin betrays you. The serpent crest ties you to the letters, the threats, and now this confrontation. Why not tell us the truth?" Victor's defiance faltered under her steady gaze, but he remained silent, his jaw tight. As Reed led him away, Miss Marple turned to Elias, her eyes searching. "You've been in the tower all this time, Mr. Pendleton. Why not come forward sooner?" Elias sighed, his arm around Clara. "I found Victor's letters demanding the pendant. I knew he'd ruin Clara if I didn't act. I hid the pendant in the tower and stayed there, watching, hoping to catch him. I didn't expect the fire, but it proved he was desperate." Miss Marple nodded, her mind piecing together the final threads. The trap had worked, revealing Elias's survival and Victor's motives. But questions lingered. The full extent of Victor's scheme and the truth of Clara's past remained partially obscured. As the clock tower loomed silent behind them, she resolved to press for answers at the police station, where Victor's confession might unravel the rest. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, the ruby pendant safe in her keeping. The night's events had clarified much, but the Hargreaves scandal and Clara's role in it demanded further inquiry. She recalled a similar case, where a man's greed had driven him to torment an innocent. Victor, she suspected, was no different. With a final glance at the pendant, she retired, her mind as sharp as ever, ready for the final chime of truth. Chapter 7. The Truth Unwound. The morning after the dramatic confrontation at the clock tower, St. Mary Mead buzzed with whispers, though the village square remained hushed under the weight of the still silent clock. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a cup of tea, reflected on the previous night's revelations. Elias Pendleton's emergence from hiding, Victor Hargreaves's apprehension, and Clara's tearful reunion with her husband had brought the mystery closer to resolution, yet threads remained untied. The ruby pendant, the serpent crest, and the Hargreaves scandal pointed to a deeper truth, one Miss Marple was determined to fully unravel. She made her way to the police station, a modest building at the edge of the village, where Constable Reed was questioning Victor Hargreaves. Reed, though diligent, welcomed Miss Marple's presence, recognising her knack for seeing what others missed. Victor sat in a sparse room, his sharp features drawn, the serpent crest pin absent from his coat. His defiance had softened, replaced by a sullen resignation as he faced the consequences of his actions. "Mr. Hargreaves," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but incisive, "you've caused quite a stir in our quiet village. The pendant, the fire, the threats to Mrs. Pendleton. Why don't you tell us the whole story? It will go easier for you." Victor's eyes flickered, meeting hers briefly before dropping to the table. After a long silence, he spoke, his voice low. "It was never about Clara, not really. The pendant was my family's, a Hargreaves heirloom. My father promised it to a creditor to cover my debts. Gambling, mostly, from years ago. When Clara was our governess, I saw a chance to shift the blame. I accused her of stealing it, thinking it would save me." Miss Marple's needles, resting in her lap, paused as she listened. "And the pendant was never stolen, was it?" she prompted. Victor shook his head. "No. Clara's mother had given it to her, a family piece from her own line, not ours. But I let the lie stand, and Clara was dismissed in disgrace. I thought the matter settled until I learned she'd married Elias, living quietly here. My creditor pressed me again, and I tracked her down, thinking I could force her to hand it over." "And the fire?" Miss Marple asked, her tone deceptively mild. "I set it," Victor admitted, his voice barely audible. "I thought if I destroyed the shop, Elias would give up the pendant to save Clara's reputation. I didn't know he was hiding in the tower, watching me." Constable Reed, taking notes, looked up sharply. "That's arson, Mr. Hargreaves, and blackmail besides. You'll answer for both." Miss Marple nodded, her mind aligning the final pieces. Victor's confession explained the fire and his pursuit of Clara, but Elias's role intrigued her. "Mr. Pendleton went to great lengths to protect his wife," she said. "The trust fund, the hidden pendant. Why such secrecy?" Victor shrugged, his bitterness evident. "Elias knew the truth. He found Clara after she fled London, broken by my lies. He married her, set up the trust with help from Grayson and Sons to secure her future, using money he'd saved from his trade. The pendant was her mother's legacy, not mine, but I thought I could claim it to settle my debts." As Reed escorted Victor to a cell, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her thoughts turning to Clara and Elias. She invited them to tea that afternoon, hoping to confirm the details and offer reassurance. The Pendletons arrived, Elias's arm around Clara, whose face was pale but relieved. The ruby pendant, now returned to Clara, glinted at her throat, a symbol of her reclaimed past. "Miss Marple," Elias began, his voice steady, "we owe you everything. You saved Clara from that man's lies and brought me back to her." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I was so afraid, Miss Marple." Victor's threats made me feel like that frightened governess again. But Elias believed in me, even when I doubted myself. Miss Marple poured tea, her smile warm. Love, my dear, is a powerful force, like the gears of a clock. It drives us to extraordinary lengths. Mr. Pendleton's devotion kept you safe, and now you can move forward. As they spoke, Miss Marple learned the final details. Elias had discovered Victor's blackmail through letters intercepted at the shop. Fearing for Clara's safety, he hid the pendant in the clock tower and staged his disappearance, using the trapdoor in the shop to slip in and out unnoticed. The 7th chime, a nod to his habit of checking the tower at dusk, was his clue to Clara, should she need to find him. The trust fund, established with Grayson and Sons, ensured Clara's security, free from the Hargreaves' shadow. The Pendletons left, their steps lighter, and Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting resumed. The village clock, repaired by Elias that morning, chimed once more, its rhythm restored. She reflected on the case, seeing parallels to a long-ago scandal in her own village, where love and greed had clashed with equal force. Victor's downfall, driven by his own desperation, was a reminder of human frailty, while Elias and Clara's bond spoke to its strength. As the evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple closed her knitting basket, her mind already alert for the next ripple in the village's quiet waters. The truth, like a clock's chime, had sounded clear, and the secret of the clockmaker's wife was finally unwound.